Okay, we're going to talk about Hegel, Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, who was probably the greatest. Well, and he was the greatest philosopher of the 19th century. He followed Immanuel Kant. So Hegel. I'm just going to introduce the basic ideas that you should be familiar with about Hegel. Hegel. Basically, he accepts a lot of stuff from Kant, dealing with the role of the mind in constituting experience, but there are radical differences between Hegel and Kant. First of all, Hegel's years of 1770 to 1831. He was a professor of philosophy at different universities, but he ended up at the University of Berlin, and at the last years of his life became basically the official philosopher of Prussia. From Hegel's a very important thinker, because from Hegel comes Karl Marx. There would be no Marx without Hegel. Hegel developed a dialectical way of looking at reality, and Marx took that over, except as Marx says, he turned Hegel upside down. Marx was a materialist and Hegel a idealist. The big word in Hegel is if you took one word out of Hegel, the most important word is Geist. And Geist is translated into English as mind or spirit. So one of his probably his greatest work, at least most well known, is the phenomenology of Geist. The phenomena. It's been in English. It's translated as a phenomenology of mind, or the phenomenology of the spirit of spirit. For Hegel, reality is mental. So basically, I think the way into Hegel, the most important way, is Hegel is the first philosopher to see history as really important. For Hegel, reality is historical. He was the first philosopher to say that. So reality is dynamic. It's historical. Ultimate reality is historical. Think of Plato, the eternal, what's really real in Plato are the eternal forms, the eternal ideas with a capital I, the eternal forms, and these are timeless, perfect, eternal. They are outside of history. Also think of the Christian concept of God. God is timeless. God is outside of history. In a sense, from a Christian standpoint, God creates history. God creates the world. For Hegel, his ultimate reality is historical. It's dynamic. And ultimate reality for Hegel is also mental and spiritual. So Hegel would totally disagree with the modern scientific view that consciousness ultimately arises as some accidental, emergent property of material objects, after billions of years of evolution. For Hegel, consciousness is in the beginning. Reality is ultimately conscious. It's mental. So Hegel, he had a big, gigantic influence on the 19th century in many different fields: history, psychology, biblical studies. He radically changed the way people looked at history. Everything now is a matter of, if you have to understand something from a Hegelian standpoint, you have to understand how it developed. Also in the 19th century, you find Darwinian evolution. So you got these two gigantic figures, Hegel and Darwin, which both saw history as reality, as essentially historical. So that's the first thing about Hegel. He's ultimate reality is historical. It's not timeless. He has a totally un-Platonic view of reality. He calls the ultimate reality the absolute, by which he means what most people would call God, except for Hegel, the absolute and is actually part of in the universe in a sense of one. There's kind of like a connection between an analogy. So between Plato, you might say, is to Aristotle as Hegel as Kant is to Hegel. I'll start out with that analogy because what Plato did is Plato had two worlds, the eternal world of the world of the forms, and then this world. What Aristotle did is he cut off the world of the forms, and he just put the forms into this world. So Plato, you might say, cuts the Platonic world into, gets rid of half of the world. The Platonic world gets rid of the world of the forms, puts them into this world. What Hegel does to Kant, like Plato, had a divided world, the world of phenomena and the world of noumena, the world of appearance and the world of ultimate reality, which we could have no knowledge of. What Hegel is going to do is just wipe out the upper world, the world of the noumena, just like Aristotle did to Plato. So I think the two most obvious influences on Hegel are Parmenides, I would say, the Greek philosopher, because Parmenides said his big idea was all is one, and then Spinoza, because like Parmenides, Spinoza said all is one. Remember, Spinoza believed there's only one substance. Deus sive natura, God or nature. So for Spinoza, reality is not split into two like it was for Descartes in the Cartesian dualism. For Spinoza, reality is one, it's unified. That's the vision behind Spinoza. In fact, Hegel said that any true philosopher has to be a Spinozist. You start with Spinoza. I mean, that just accept it as that's where you begin. So Hegel has this unified vision of reality. It's all one, and it's Geist. It's inherently mental. So in this, he disagrees with Spinoza, who thought that this absolute had infinite properties, one of which was extension. For Hegel, reality is ultimately spiritual. So that's the first thing. And then reality is historical. It constantly changes. It's constantly changing. So any God that Hegel would countenance, the absolute, what he calls the absolute, is not independent of experience, but actually is part of historical development. And since there's only one substance, our individual minds actually participate in Geist, in the absolute. For Hegel, history is actually, if you want to understand God or the absolute, you have to understand the development of history, because the absolute comes to be aware of itself as the absolute in human history. So from a Hegelian standpoint, another very important thing is that for Hegel, history is not like it is in Macbeth, a tale told by an idiot, so full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. For Hegel, history is significant. It's the unfolding of the absolute. Hegel sees the development as occurring in a dialectical fashion, and the terms that are used to talk about the Hegelian system are thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So whenever you read anything about Hegel, you're going to read about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. One of the interesting things is that Hegel actually never uses these terms. And so, a lot of times people talk about the Hegel thesis, antithesis, synthesis. At least you should point out that Hegel himself never uses this terminology, he doesn't use that terminology. So a lot of people think that actually these are Hegel who talks about synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So if you all you know about Hegel is from what you've read about him and from other people talking. You'll be very surprised when you actually go to Hegel's writings not to find these words. Now, you could say that these concepts, even though they're not actually used, the words, what they denote, you could say, is actually, you could find this in his system, in his works. But anyway, the idea here is that reality is inherently conflictual. There's constant conflict. In this way, in this sense, he goes back to Heraclitus, and actually he thought Heraclitus was a very profound thinker. Another Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, thought that the reality is a series of conflicts, and Hegel agreed. For Hegel, think of a thesis as basically you have something and then existing, and then you have the opposite, and then you have a synthesis. For example, for Hegel's an idealist, so basically this dialectic is worked out in history. One good example would be, think of Plato. Think of Parmenides, who says all is one, there is no change. Think of him as a thesis. And then Heraclitus says, well, what are you talking about? There's all is one, there's no change. There's change all around. You can see everything's constantly changing. One day it's raining, one day it's sunny. So Heraclitus. So these are the thesis, antithesis. A, not A. Opposites. Okay, that would be an example, thesis, antithesis. And then what Hegel says, that's how reality works. And then these contradictory elements actually then come together, and they're synthesized and they're brought together. The truth of each one is preserved in a higher reality. In Hegelian terms, the conflict or the contradiction is aufgehoben. It's raised to a higher level. And in this way, you could say, well, in Plato, remember we talked about Plato, how in the Platonic view of reality, in Plato's view of reality, he keeps the truth of both of them, but he says they're both right and they're both wrong. And that's actually what Hegel said about all great philosophers. They're both right, they're right and they're wrong. Parmenides is right to say that all is one. Plato said that's true about the world of the ideas. And Heraclitus said everything is changing. Plato said that's true about the world of sense experience. So for Hegel, reality, that's how reality proceeds, through conflict. In ancient Athens, where the individual is one with the society, that would be the thesis, and you have contradiction is in the person of Socrates. Socrates represents the opposite view, where you have to individual conscience, you have to think for yourself. That causes a conflict, and that ultimately leads to a new culture, which has to synthesize both of those elements. And that's how history progresses. Think of a child, most children are very, nice and so unhappy with their parents, and they become teenagers, and then the opposite. Now you have all hell breaks out, and then when they become more adults, when they become adults, there's a synthesis. Where the childhood and the teenage years are somehow reconciled to create the adult. That's how history for Hegel works, constant conflict. And the reason you have constant development is because every situation is inherently unstable. Hegel believes that history is leading towards a goal, and the goal, I'll talk about this more in the next little lecture, but the goal for Hegel is what he calls self-knowledge and also freedom. So Hegel discerns in the development of history, he discerns a pattern where if you look at historical history as a whole, what you see is there's a development of knowledge. Think of our modern science, technology. We've developed over the thousands of years. We know a lot more than they did in the past, and there's a development of freedom. People nowadays, we don't accept slavery anymore, whereas in the ancient world, slavery was accepted. It's no longer accepted in today's world because we've progressed. So reality for Hegel is moving towards what he calls absolute knowledge and freedom. I'll talk about more of that in the next lecture. This is kind of just a brief introduction to Hegel, and I'll talk more in the next lecture about it.